All right, let me get started. I'm Helen Freeh, and just to give you a little bit of biography about myself, I have a master's in political philosophy and also a bachelor's in political philosophy from the University of Dallas. And then I went on to Baylor University to receive my PhD in English literature. And I'd initially thought that I would pursue my doctorate in Southern American literature. I was really interested in Tolkien at the time. I'm sorry, in William Faulkner at the time. But as I pursued my coursework, I just realized, quite frankly, how depressing Southern American literature was, and particularly how depressing William Faulkner was. I always kind of imagined him at his typewriter with bourbon in one hand and typing away and saying, "Oh, this is really good. This is really good." You know, take another swing back. But it was depressing. And yet, again, in God's providence, I pursued modern American literature, I think, as a way to help me understand what the problem in modernity is that Tolkien himself is responding to. And so it wasn't until later in my graduate career that I attended a lecture with Dr. Ralph Wood at Baylor, who was lecturing on Tolkien. And I suddenly realized, oh, I've loved Tolkien my whole life. My father and my mother used to read it to us when we were children. And I suddenly realized when I attended this academic lecture that I could pursue Tolkien as an academic pursuit, as a subject of my dissertation. And so I approached Dr. Wood with this idea, and he cautioned me against it, the wise man that he is. He said, "Helen, if you go that route, you're going to be marked. You'll have a really hard time finding a position in academia." He said, because Tolkien is so dismissed by so many academics. And sadly, the reason why he's dismissed, and maybe you might get a chuckle out of this, maybe you might not, is that he's too easy to understand. So that was kind of my introduction to academia, was this idea of just the truth that somehow is for the elites. And if it's beyond the masses, then therefore it must be academic. But I did decide to pursue Tolkien as my dissertation subject, and Dr. Wood was right. It did mark me as a particular type of scholar, but that was okay. What I was interested in was not so much a job, but really pursuing the truth and pursuing something that I loved. And I loved Tolkien. As I studied him academically, I really grew to love him more and more. So I'm just thrilled to be able to now share my love of Tolkien with you all. I'm sorry I can't see your faces. I'll fix this for next week, but I'm not going to waste time trying to get the gallery view, which always looks like Brady Bunch anyways, with everybody looking in the different squares. But I'll look forward to seeing your faces next week when we gather. So first of all, kudos to all of you for signing up for this Magnus course, because it takes a type of courage, but also a type of sense of wonder to want to, if you're on the East Coast, after your supper and before bed, say, you know what, I want to log in for 2 hours and have an intellectual conversation about a particular subject. Or if you're on the West Coast, the Pacific time zone, which is where I personally am in right now, that takes another type of courage to say, I am so exhausted after work, and yet I'm going to sign on and do this because it's important. And it is important because God has made us to be thinking men and women, and to call us to something higher than simply say our base passions, just getting a drink after work, settling down in front of the TV, and watching whatever is on Tuesday night. Honestly, I have no idea because I haven't watched TV for a long time, mostly for cheapskate reasons. As a graduate student, the cable was cut, and that just kind of continued to my my mid-40s. Just to tell you a little bit about my own teaching style, I usually don't like to lecture exclusively. I like to give you initially a lecture, but then to shift it into discussion. And so in that sense, we would have a back and forth conversation. After tonight, I will send you, or at least I'll post on the Magnus website, discussion questions. These are the ones that guide me in my own leading of you in the book and in the themes of the book that you want to focus on. And it also helps you in thinking about how you might respond to some of the questions or conversation that that comes up during the course of. But for tonight, it is going to be a little bit lecture heavy. Part of that is because I want to give you an overview of Tolkien's life. Second of all, I want to give you a brief lecture on how distinct friendship is in Tolkien's work. And you can really only understand that through first understanding the idea of friendship from the classical perspective. So I hope everyone had the chance to read that 2-page handout that I sent you regarding Aristotle on friendship. Again, it is a professor friend of mine said a pigeon philosophy, which means we're not reading all of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We're just looking at about 3 pages of that great work. So let me stop first. And again, unfortunately, I'm handicapped because I can't see hands or anyone wanting to interrupt me. So I might need to rely on others to interrupt me with if someone needs to ask a question. So I'll stop right now and see if anyone has any questions before we start our initial lecture on Tolkien's biography.
Dr. Freeh, can I just say if someone wants to say something, just to blurt it out?
Sure, that's fine. Will I be interrupted? Like, will I stop and know that someone's trying to interrupt me?
If they're speaking, yeah.
Okay. All right. That's great. I'm still desperately trying to find gallery view on here, but I came onto Zoom through the Magnus site, and so I'm not sure. Maybe it's not here.
Okay.
Okay, I gave you a chance for questions. Let's launch into it. Again, Tolkien, and I love it too. I noticed how many people signed up for this course, and once again, I said Tolkien has a draw to his work that is very powerful and makes people want to understand more. It's more than just, you could say, a book club, which we read it once, once and done. But people really want to understand, why does this work? Why does it speak to me, or why does it speak to other people so much? I need to read this and really understand what's going on here. One caveat, really strong caveat, and I'll bring up Peter Jackson's movies often in this course, but do not substitute watching the movie for reading the book. That's so important. And the reason I say that is that movies, directors, producers, screenwriters, they themselves are creating a worldview based on their imagination of a story. And so Peter Jackson's Middle Earth is Peter Jackson's Middle Earth. It is not necessarily Tolkien's Middle Earth. They may intersect in certain areas, but they certainly diverge in really key areas, and I'll point those out. So again, if you're taking this class thinking, I saw the movies, don't need to read the book, you have to read the book, because otherwise you'll be missing really integral things, and particularly in the area of the spiritual life, the spiritual dimension. What is Tolkien doing spiritually? Because that is the major area that Peter Jackson and his screenwriters get wrong in the book, in the movie. It has otherwise a lot of really positive things to it, but it also has some pretty concerning and troubling negatives to it that really speak to, you can say, the problems of our postmodern and post-Christian era. But we'll talk about that as these 8 weeks progress. One other thing to mention regarding this course is we're only reading the Fellowship of the Ring. I'm really grateful to the Magnus Institute for letting me propose a 3-course class. on Tolkien's great work. It's often called a trilogy because it's split into 3 books. Tolkien never intended it as a trilogy. That was only for practical reasons of the cost of paper after World War II that it was ever split into 3. But it is also convenient to have it split into 3 because, quite honestly, it would be a real disservice to the work to try to cover the entire thing within 8 weeks. And to be honest, I probably wouldn't even propose such a thing. Okay, so let's get into it. So I want to give you a brief but important biography on J.R.R. Tolkien because an author's life does shape his or her work. Tolkien was born in South Africa to Arthur and Mabel Tolkien, and he has only one brother, Hilary. Mabel returns with the 2 boys when they're young. She returns to England just for a family visit. She was fully intending to go back. So she returns in 1895 to England. Tolkien at this point is about 3 years old. His younger brother is only 1 year old. And while she's back in England, her husband, Arthur, dies of yellow fever. So Mrs. Tolkien is now widowed, and she moves in with her parents in the industrial town of Birmingham in England. Her parents are Baptists, and her in-laws are Unitarian. And again, the faith tradition is important because of the conversion that's going to happen to Roman Catholicism. Mabel tutors both the boys in the things that she loved the most, which were botany, language, and art. And so you see that absolutely in the influence on J.R.R. Tolkien and his art. If I had the time, I would do a book on this woman, something like Faith of Our Mothers, because she must have been an amazing woman, given her abilities at schooling her sons. Mrs. Tolkien was skilled in both penmanship and languages. She has full command of Greek, of Latin, of French, and the young Tolkien could read and write proficiently before he was 4 years old. So either that speaks to a type of savant nature of Tolkien, picking up things, or it shows what an amazing teacher his mother must have been. I personally homeschool, and I can tell you from my own experience that I'm still working really hard to get my now 7-year-old to be a proficient reader and certainly a proficient writer. So Mabel always interests me a great deal. It's extremely important that she converts to Roman Catholicism in the year 1900, so right at the turn of the century. And she converts under the influence of the Birmingham Oratory. And this oratory is the one that St. John Henry Newman had established after his own conversion to Roman Catholicism in the mid-19th century. When she converts, she is completely disowned by her family, and she is left to fend for herself and for the boys with no financial support. So what did it mean to convert to Roman Catholicism? Let me check this text here. I see what you're saying, Nicole. Okay, let me try that. Nicole's suggesting that we break really quickly, and I'm gonna no, okay, this is much nicer because I can see everyone's face. That makes me happy. Okay, so the conversion to Roman Catholicism in 1900. So what did it mean to convert to Roman Catholicism for a British Protestant? This is something that as Americans, we often just don't even consider what the ramifications are of conversion from a political standpoint, because we have such freedom of religion and religious faith as almost a tenet of Americanism. Not so much the same for a particularly British woman in the turn of the 20th century. So what did it mean for her to become a Roman Catholic? It meant everything. Faith and patriotism were very much equated in the British Anglican viewpoint. Catholicism unlike other non-Anglican denominations like the Baptists or the Unitarians of Mabel Tolkien's family, they were not seen as the faith of the national enemies of England, like France or Spain, and even Ireland, even though Ireland was a conquered nation. It wasn't until the early 20th century that centuries old laws banning Catholics from public office were lifted. And if you know anything about what St. John Henry Newman suffered after he became Roman Catholic, then you understand also what's going on here to a lesser degree, but even still with Mabel. So this is in 1900. In 1904, Mabel dies of complications from diabetes. And she dies after 4 years of very great financial hardship. She had already attached herself to the Birmingham Oratory. And so after her death, she assigned guardianship of her 2 sons to Father Francis Morgan, who was an oratorian. And she asked him to raise her sons as Roman Catholics, which he did very well. Tolkien himself refers to Father Francis in his own letters as his second father, which Father Francis very much was. If you read Tolkien's letters, and I highly encourage you to do that if you want a more intimate glimpse into Tolkien's life, his thinking, his spirituality, but he says in his letters repeatedly that he sees his mother's early death as a type of martyrdom, because it occurred because she was Catholic. He believed that had she not become Catholic, had she not converted, she would have had the financial means necessary to take care of herself and thus not die at an early age. So again, from his childhood and until his death, he took his Catholicism very seriously. He wasn't a cradle Catholic, but he is what's called a convinced Catholic. He saw the Protestant Reformation as one of the greatest mistakes of human history. And he also sees it as the harbinger of this modern period of relativism. He had particular antagonism to Anglicans. He referred to, and if anyone's Anglican here, then these are Tolkien's words, they're not mine. I myself was baptized in the Episcopal faith. My father always called us Anglicans because he wanted to distinguish us from, I guess, low church Episcopalians and high church Episcopalians. But he says to Anglicans that they were, quote, a pathetic and shadowy medley of half-remembered traditions and mutilated beliefs. So again, our author can be quite opinionated at times. So Tolkien holds to the Catholic faith despite plenty of difficult times throughout his life. Just as a side note, if you also want to read his own take on Vatican II and the changes in the church that occur in the late 60s, he's got some fascinating letters that have to do with that changeover, the aggiornamento, as it was called. Tolkien went to King Edward's School in Birmingham, and he forms a very close and a deep friendship with 3 other young men, Rob Gilson, Geoffrey Smith, and Christopher Wiseman. They formed a secret society, which they called the TCBS, which stood for the Tea Club and Barovian Society. And I like the dangerous way that people lived in the past. So what they did to rebel was they met and they drank tea and they wrote poetry together illegally in the library. So I guess for them that was questionable. It's not like the nasty TikTok challenges of our present day. But Tolkien considers this early friendship the most important of his life. His later adult friendship with C.S. Lewis was closely akin to his early bond with these other young men, but he never loses this deep friendship that he formed with these other men. Again, the 4 would discuss ideas, poetry. They would share their work and they would comment on each other's work, and they call themselves the Immortal 4. I'll discuss more about them when I get into Tolkien and the Great War. It doesn't have a happy ending, just so you know. Tolkien meets his future wife at the very young age of 16, and Edith Bratt was 19, so 3 years her senior. Both Tolkien and Edith are orphans, but they live at the same boarding house. Humphrey Carpenter, who's the official biographer of Tolkien, reports on their early teenage courtship in the authorized biography. And he talks about how they would meet for tea in a tea shop, and they would toss little sugar cubes down into the large hats of the ladies who were passing by. And I always like that image because I think it shows a real playfulness on the part of Tolkien, and not the stodginess that sometimes people perceive when they think about him in his later life as the Oxford Don. But he fell deeply in love with Edith, and they decide early on they want to marry each other. But there's two big problems. One is that Edith is not Catholic, and two, Tolkien is not even 18 yet. And so I think quite understandably, Father Francis, again, his guardian, he says Tolkien is too young to form this alliance. He had just received a type of what we call a scholarship to Oxford, and Father Francis worries for his ward that an early marriage would really derail his studies and a successful future life. And so Father Francis forbids Tolkien from communicating with Edith until Tolkien is 21 years old. And at this point, Tolkien is 17 or maybe 18. So Tolkien is looking at a 3 to 4 year period of complete non-communication with this woman that he would like to marry. But Tolkien is obedient. He obeys his guardian, and he has absolutely no contact with Edith for 3 to 4 years. And this is really throughout his whole of his Oxford undergraduate years. But I think it's a great romance story because on the eve of his 21st birthday, which would have been early January, Tolkien writes a beautiful love letter, which I would love to see. It's never been published, but I'm sure someone must have it. But he writes a beautiful love letter to Edith, declaring that he still loves her and he wants to marry her. And so they meet and they became engaged. She converts to Catholicism, and they're married at a Catholic church in Warwick, St. Mary Immaculate Church. And there's a little plaque there now indicating that if you ever go to visit. But they get married on the 22nd of March in 1916. And this happens immediately before, if you're at all students of history, you're thinking, what else is going on in 1916 with poor British young men? And that's the Great War, World War I. And so Tolkien is shipped off to the French front and the Battle of the Somme immediately after getting married. So let me shift now and talk about the influence of World War I, of the Great War on Tolkien. I'll stop for a minute, see if anyone has any questions before we keep on going. Okay. A wonderful book on Tolkien and the Great War is by an author called John Garth, G-A-R-T-H. Has a easy title to remember. It's called Tolkien and the Great War. I think it's an excellent book on this time period, and not just on Tolkien. It's not a book just on Tolkien, but it's a book on World War I and its absolutely devastating effects on England. So Tolkien volunteers for the army very soon after he's married. The UK is already engaged in the war, and Tolkien enters as a second lieutenant. World War I devastates England culturally. The total number of deaths on all sides, both military and civilian, was about 16 million people, with another 21 million wounded. So again, you can just imagine what that must have been like psychologically and spiritually on the nation. If we look at the deaths from the past 20 years in Afghanistan, they're nothing compared to what happened in World War I. And I think I forget who said this or where this number comes from, but there are more people who die in the 20th century by violence than in all other wars combined throughout history. And the war is particularly devastating psychologically because England and also Europe in the 19th century had truly believed in the idea of progressivism, and that's progressivism with a capital P. It's an actual ism, an idea. And this was the idea that if we only ordered our political and our religious institutions correctly, then we would achieve utopia, we would achieve peace. And there was a very firm belief that with the rise of economic status of European nations, with the interchange of commerce, that essentially the nations were too closely bound to ever go to war with each other. There's another fantastic book called The Guns of August, if you've ever read that as well. And Barbara Tuchman, the author of that book, she gets into this whole idea in the beginning of that book, this firm idea that Europeans had that war was inconceivable if we just interrelied on each other financially and economically enough. So they truly believed in this idea of progressivism. War had died. There would be no war. And World War I was the bloodiest war that human history had ever seen. Two of Tolkien's dear friends die in 1916. This is during the great battle, horrible battle of the Somme. And these are Rob Gilson and Geoffrey Smith. And these deaths strike Tolkien very hard because he knows that potential greatness has been cut short. He acknowledges in one of his letters to Christopher Wiseman, the fourth friend that he had, that his own ability to compose great works of literature would never be the same without the presence of the other two to help him in his own endeavors. And so already you see the great importance of a single human soul that's emerging in Tolkien's own understanding of life. Humans are never meant to be individuals, but they're always meant to be persons who live in community. I'll talk about individuals as we get on in this class, but the term individual is very much an Enlightenment term, a modern term, and it is referencing in some sense all of us as separate beings, as opposed to the human person, which by its very nature involves other persons. So humans are not meant to be individuals, but they're meant to be in community. Tolkien says in a very moving letter to Christopher Wiseman, after hearing of Gilson's death, that he feels, quote, but a mere individual now. So here you see Tolkien using that word individual, but in some sense a pejorative way. It's not how we ought to be. We ought to be in community. There's a very poignant final letter of Geoffrey Smith to Tolkien. It's his last letter that he writes, in which Smith says, quote, and I'll read this because it's just very beautiful and always kind of brings tears to my eyes thinking about what these men, really what any person has to endure in battlefield situations. But Smith writes, quote, my chief consolation is that if I am scuppered tonight, there will still be left a member of the great TCBS to voice what I dreamed and what we all agreed upon. For the death of one of its members cannot put an end to the immortal four. May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say long after I am not there to say them, if such be my lot. I'll try not to get emotional, even though I've read that letter multiple times. So friendship. Friendship is one of the most important things for Tolkien, faith and friendship. So what is friendship for Tolkien? This is what we'll be discussing throughout the semester. What is friendship? What contributes to it? What counters it? How is friendship the element that really defeats darkness, that defeats evil? Why is friendship so essential to the human person? And ultimately, how does friendship connect to a God who loves us and who himself has become friends with us? But even now, at the beginning of our own conversation with each other, we can say that for Tolkien, true friendship is a foretaste of the heavenly banquet, the exchange of ideas, the exchange of love, of affection for another person reflects partially the love that God has for his creation, has for humankind. So ultimately, man's friendship with God will be of utmost importance. And yet, no man can be friends with God who isn't able to maintain a human friendship. Aquinas says we move from the natural to the supernatural. We can't just, boom, start at the supernatural. We have to begin already with this natural, earthy world that is around us. And so friendship is so key to not only a person's place in the world, but also his or her interaction with the world. This universal theme of friendship in many ways dominates Tolkien's work. And if one considers it as part of your own life, friendship in one way or another dominates our lives, dominates your life. Other themes, of course, play a role in Tolkien's work. One of those everyone points out is the battle of good versus evil. But it's not just that. That's what I always say when someone says, oh, Tolkien's work is about good and evil. You say, well, yes, it is. But it's a lot more than just the word between good and evil. In some sense, sort of looking at how it is this battle between good and evil requires us to define what is good, define what is evil, and to have a common consensus about that. Because obviously in our own day and age, we're seeing people call things good, which once were called evil, calling things evil, which once were called good. Tolkien absolutely will not be a relativist when it comes to good and evil. He holds in a firm and an objective truth of what those things actually entail. Tom Shippey, Shippey, is another very well-known critic of J.R.R. Tolkien. He wrote an excellent book called J.R.R. Tolkien, the Author of the Century. It's now a little bit dated because he was writing this at the turn of the, what are we now, 21st century? I still don't use that too often. So 2000, we switched over to the 21st century. But he names Tolkien the author of the century because he says that Tolkien's work confronts the origin, this is his words, quote, the origin and nature of evil. So again, Shippey is one of those critics that really focuses on evil, good and evil, as the main themes of Tolkien's work. But I'm going to suggest that Tolkien addresses the nature of evil. I acknowledge it's absolutely true, but he does this by looking at a much deeper question, and frankly, a more difficult question, which is, what is the principle of order that defines a world in which radical evil and suffering continue to flourish side by side with the flourishing of love and friendship? You know, these relationships that we can clearly see, clearly define, clearly say these are not evil, and yet we also clearly see evil in our world. And that's what Tolkien is getting at. And it's a hard question. It's a hard question to answer. It's the question that many Christians receive. Why does a good God allow evil things to happen to innocent people? That challenging question. Well, the answer to this question is very much integral for understanding a person's place in the world. And Tolkien's great contribution to the 20th century, I mean, this is why he is not only the author of the century, but continues to be a very relevant author even to our own times in 2021. He answers this despair, the despair of materialism, the despair of determinism that arose really starting in the 18th century during the Enlightenment. But as we see just looking around, it's increased in magnitude, even into our own times. So I argue that Tolkien is the author of the century because he gives a response to this sense of hopelessness that's caused by a belief of a type of fated entrapment in the world, that the self is worthless, that our efforts are worthless. We see this despair in much of 20th century and 21st century literature. The despair is presented, the hopelessness is presented, but an answer is not provided. And maybe because many of those authors cannot provide an answer, all they see is the despair. But Tolkien does not leave his readers in despair. He chooses a really radical way of writing his literature. And this is one of the reasons why he's dismissed by many academics, because he chooses to write a fictional secondary world that is whole and consistent, and yet it is not our world, and yet our world is also fully reflected in this secondary world of Middle Earth that Tolkien creates. And in the secondary world, he returns his modern audience to this ancient yet extremely relevant conflict between fate, providence, and the place of the person's own free will. He picks up the discussion and he presents it to us, his modern audience, in a way that we can at least hear, if not wholly accept. We can at least be open to what he's saying. Tolkien uses myth and poetics rather than a direct philosophical or theological discourse as his means for presenting anew the universal problem of human free will before deterministic and antagonistic forces for good or for evil. Friendship and selfless love is at the heart of evil's defeat. And it's the lack of these things that we see in Tolkien's work that cause evil to flourish. If you have any knowledge of Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis's work, perhaps already you might be seeing the difference between Tolkien and Lewis in their approach to an evangelical literature. Lewis chooses that theological discourse to try to achieve conversion. Tolkien steps back and he says, if conversion happens, conversion happens. But if it doesn't, it doesn't, because that's not my aim as an author. My aim is not to convert your heart. My aim is to show you the truth. And if the truth converts, the truth converts. If it doesn't, the person needs to perhaps have more prayers. But we'll talk about the difference in Tolkien and Lewis's approach as we continue this discussion as well, because I think it's very relevant even to our own day with how does one convey truth? How does one convey one's own beliefs? And Tolkien chooses the poetic versus the philosophical. Okay, this is a simple formula. It's brilliantly used by Tolkien regarding friendship and selfless love. But let me stop here and see if you have any questions, thoughts, observations, responses.
I had a quick question in terms of, like, from a timeline perspective. Is his friendship with C.S. Lewis, is that brought out within the Lord of the Rings or the Fellowship of the Rings, or is that sort of an incidental sort of sidebar in his life?
No, it's not incidental sidebar. I think that you could argue that all of his relationships and friendships are brought out within the work, but because the work is absolutely not allegory, you can't point to one character and say, I'm just putting this out there. You say Gandalf represents C.S. Lewis in The Lord of the Rings. You can't say that because Tolkien he's so hated allegory. He would never have done that. But you could say attributes of Lewis are seen in each of the characters in different elements, just like attributes of his friends are seen in different characters within the novel. Aspects of his love for Edith are seen in the Arwen-Aragorn relationship. If you know, again, his biography, he sets Beren and Luthien as the names on his and his wife's tombstone. But is he barren? Is she Luthien? No, but there's elements of that are part of their story. So he became friends with Lewis in his adulthood. I became friends with Lewis in the early 1930s. And so he's already a middle-aged man at that point. And Lewis was very influential in even having the Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien was a huge procrastinator and he was a perfectionist. So he was always writing and rewriting. Lewis, he wrote a lot and he published a lot because Lewis just was not the same type of perfectionist that Tolkien was. And so really it was just Lewis that finally said to Tolkien, get it out there, stop rewriting. This is good enough, publish this. And thus we have the Lord of the Rings, thanks to C.S. Lewis and his push. Does that answer your question, Scott?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Did Tolkien start writing when he was a kid? Was he writing stories when he was very young?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. He was already writing poetry when he was, I think, 7 or 8. The one poem that most strikes me is a poem that he wrote when he was part of the TCBS. That is essentially the initial view of what becomes, in the opening of the Silmarillion, the opening creation myth, which is called the Ainulindala. And again, I'm giving you all these extra things to read. But if you don't read anything else from the Silmarillion, read those first 5 pages, which is the creation myth of Middle Earth. And it's got a lot of umlauts, but it's called the Ainulindala. And he continues that poem in the trenches of World War II or World War I. And that's why it so strikes me, because the myth itself is a myth about how evil mars good, and yet good continues to take what evil does and not deny the evil, but to intertwine. Good is so powerful, it intertwines the evil into something new that we never really expected before. And Tolkien's very careful to say, it doesn't mean that it was good for evil to have been. And that's absolutely true. And so what I think is so moving about that is Tolkien objectively has a really hard childhood. He loses his father when he's about 4 years old. He loses his mother when he's 11 years old. He's kind of have to raise his baby brother on his own. He himself is raised by a type of foster father. He goes to World War I, where so many friends were killed, particularly two very dear friends. And again, if you know the literature of Britain during this time, post World War I, it completely rejects God. It completely rejects providence. It fully embraces the hedonism that we call the Roaring Twenties. But the Roaring Twenties in England were a lot more roaring than the Roaring Twenties in America. Really, the Roaring Twenties in England are almost more like our 1960s in America. But Tolkien does not choose to do that. Instead, we see in his early writings this firm belief in providence, that no denial of evil. I mean, evil is all around him. He sees it in the trenches of the war. But that evil doesn't somehow erase this greater vision that he has of God's goodness and of God's providence. So that's what always strikes me about his early writing, is that you already see this absolute confidence in a type of providential hand that rules the world.
Could you say a few words about how The Hobbit and the Silmarillion fit in around Lord of the Rings?
Sure. First, I'll say The Hobbit initially does not. It's the Silmarillion that Tolkien calls the work of his heart. And again, it begins, one could argue, in the trenches of World War I. And he continues writing and rewriting and adding to it over and over and over again throughout his whole life, so that he actually never publishes what we know as the Silmarillion. What we know as the Silmarillion is thanks to his son, Christopher Tolkien, who assembled, it was a yeoman's work, because if you've seen the History of Middle-earth volumes, I think there's something like 12 volumes of the History of Middle-earth, which are all of his unfinished writings about this world. But his son, Christopher, in 1973, 73, I think. Maybe it's 74. I have to check the publication date. He assembles these things into a manageable and understandable narrative, which is the Silmarillion. But so Tolkien's always working on Middle Earth as it's understood in the Silmarillion. But just for money, as any teacher knows, you don't really make that much teaching. And so Tolkien picked up extra work by grading exams during the off season of Oxford. And he was so bored with writing the exams that he very famously just flipped it over and just wrote a thought that was in his head, which was, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And he was a linguist, and he thought, well, where does the word hobbit come from? Why did I even think of that? So we began to do research into the word hobbit, and then thus began this whole world of the hobbits, which quite honestly initially did not fit in to the Silmarillion. He wrote it just for fun, and he wrote it for his own children. But even as he finished the writing of it, and you can see this in the course of The Hobbit, it moves very much from a much more lighthearted to a much more serious tale, and it ends in a much more serious way than it began. But it was separate. It was separate from Lord of the Rings, or from Silmarillion. But there are a couple of things that drifted into The Hobbit almost by necessity because of his imagination. And those were, for instance, the necromancer, when he references the necromancer in there. But The Hobbit was so popular with both Britain and then also America that everyone was clamoring for more hobbits. And so his publisher, Stanley Unwin, came back to him and said, everybody loves your work. We want more hobbits. What else do you have to give me? And Tolkien says, oh, I've got the Silmarillion. So he stacks on this huge manuscript on his poor publisher's desk. Boom, it's the Silmarillion. And Stanley Unwin looks at it and says, I don't even know what to make of this. As somebody said, he said kind of rudely, and he almost lost Tolkien's business for the rest of his life. He called it a telephone book of elvish names, is what he said. And Tolkien was really offended. But thanks to C.S. Lewis, his pride was assuaged. And he began to say, okay, how do the hobbits fit into this? And so in some sense, he makes the hobbits fit into his world of the Silmarillion, of Middle Earth, because they don't fit in the way he had originally had envisioned it. But the way he recrafts it with the Lord of the Rings, he achieves that connection that the Hobbit itself is kind of lacking. So that's why many people, when they read, they think, oh, I love the Lord of the Rings, I love the Hobbit, I think I'll read the Silmarillion, and they pick up the Silmarillion and they say, oh, this is not at all what I was expecting. So I really don't recommend the Silmarillion to a lot of people, unless you're willing to read it with an understanding of what's going on, because the tone and tenor is extremely different in the Silmarillion from Lord of the Rings. So did that answer your question, Jan? Okay, I hate to do exclusive lecture because I get bored just hear myself talk, but sometimes it's kind of necessary just to get the things that I want you to see out there. So if you have any other questions, I want to turn to that handout that I wanted you to read from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Again, I'm a loving senior fellow. I didn't say let's read all of the Nicomachean Ethics. I just said let's read a little bit of it just to have an understanding. So we're going to talk about friendship according to Aristotle, and this is the pagan or the classical viewpoint. And if I have classical philosophers among you, forgive my my pigeon philosophy. Just want to get some key points out and not get into the details or to really bore you with the details of everything about friendship according to the pagan or classical view, but kind of point out some essential things. A lot of people have criticized Tolkien for being derivative. They say, oh, his work is derivative. Tolkien does present an image of friendship that absolutely is derivative, derivative of something that has preceded him. He represents for a post-Christian modern audience a perennial Christian truth. So again, he's not giving us anything that is new, except he's presenting it to us in a new fashion or a new way. Again, it may sound denigrating to say that Tolkien doesn't offer any new ideas in his literature. One of the consequences of the Enlightenment is this emphasis or overemphasis on innovation, together with the glorification of the individual. But Tolkien understands, as King Solomon declares in the book of Ecclesiastes, that what has been will be again, and what has been will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Again, for the modern and the postmodern, the term derivative is pejorative, and it's a dismissive statement of someone as an artist. But for Tolkien, the very nature of the artist is to be derivative in nature. He has a beautiful work on literary criticism, which is called On Fairy Stories. It's about a 40-page essay, but really well worth reading. Because in that work, he illustrates that God himself is the first creator, and he's the only artist who can ever do anything that's actually new. And God, of course, does create new things. He says every other human creator is what Tolkien calls a quote unquote sub-creator. He creates from the material that's first made new by the creator. It's a really bad joke, and I'm terrible at telling jokes. I always forget the punchline. But this is a terribly bad joke about, I've got to pause for a second, remember the punchline so that I don't ruin it for you. There's an atheist and God, and they're having a debate. And the atheist says, we've gotten to the point with science that we could do anything that you do, God. It doesn't really matter. So the atheist challenges God to a creation contest, and God's sitting back and he's just listening to the atheist go on and on about how much God is not needed and how the atheist can do everything. And so God says, okay, well, give it your best shot. What do you think is the hardest thing that I do? And the atheist says, well, probably create human beings. And God said, yeah, that's probably a pretty hard thing to do. And the atheist said, no problem. We're creating human beings all the time now. And God said, okay, well, let's do that as our contest. Okay, this is where I'm struggling to remember who goes first. Okay, so God picks up a handful of dirt from the ground, picks up a handful of dirt, he molds it, spits on it, and he blows breath on it, and it forms a beautiful new man, woman. And there is this new creation standing in front of the atheist. And God says, okay, your turn. So the atheist says, that's so easy. So atheist picks up some dirt and is about to blow on it, and God slaps his hand and says, hey, go get your own dirt. Okay, good. You're on mute, so I can't hear you.
That's so funny.
Hey, thanks for the fake laugh. Yeah, so go get your own dirt. But it's a great image. The joke is a great image of what Tolkien is talking about. None of us can make our dirt. We all get the dirt that's been made by God himself. And so we would be a fool to say that we create ex nihilo. The only person who creates ex nihilo from nothing is God himself. So Tolkien creates a secondary world that is proudly derivative. He's proud that it is derivative. It is derivative of much in the tradition of myth, literature, poetry, history, theology, philosophy, all these great giants that have preceded him. Tolkien builds upon it. One of the derivative presentations he makes is the nature of friendship and its role and importance to the community. And this is going to bring us to Aristotle and I think it's a 3-page handout that I wanted you to read. And if you didn't, that's okay. You read it. tomorrow night at the 5 o'clock hour after your busy workday. But Aristotle is a 4th century BC pagan, of course, pagan Greek. His Nicomachean Ethics sets the classical understanding of friendship. It itself is the foundation for what becomes the Christian understanding. Tolkien both reflects Aristotle's classifications of friendship, and he challenges and he furthers the Aristotelian understanding precisely because of the radical nature of Jesus Christ and Christ's incarnation and how Christ himself changes the pagan viewpoint. So before moving to friendship in Tolkien, let's first understand what Aristotle rightly says, and then understand what the limitations of his understanding are. The handout I gave you comes from book 8 of the Ethics. And it's in this book that Aristotle lays out the 3 classifications of friendship. He says there are ones of utility, ones of pleasure, and ones of virtue. You can classify any friendship into one of those 3. Friends who are of use to you, friends who are of pleasure to you, and friends whom you like because you have a shared common virtue or common good. Aristotle argues that friendship is essential to all people. We can't live alone. So in essence, he radically differs from some of the Enlightenment philosophers who do argue that we can live alone, that we come together in a social contract, again, purely for utility, but by nature, we're solitary. That's not according to Aristotle. He says we can't live alone, but he says we have to understand the different forms of friendship. For not all relationships, not all forms of friendship are actually alike. So he classifies friendship according to the 3 things that we love. We love things that are useful to us. We love things that are pleasurable to us. And we love things because they are good in and of themselves. So his basis of understanding is that all men love what is good for themselves. So in other words, no one would purposefully choose what is harmful or bad to themselves. So he says, even the bad man chooses what he thinks is good for himself. Aristotle states, and this is from your handout, it says, quote, there are therefore 3 kinds of friendship, equal in number to the things that are lovable. Those who love for the sake of utility, love for the sake of what is good for themselves, and those who love for the sake of pleasure, do so for the sake of what is pleasant to themselves, and not insofar as the other person is loved, but insofar as he is useful or pleasant. For it is not as being the man he is that the loved person is loved, but as providing some good or pleasure. Such friendships then are easily dissolved. Aristotle goes on, he says, but the final friendship is the, quote, perfect friendship. The perfect friendship is the friendship of men who are good and alike in virtue. For these wish well alike to each other qua good, and they are good themselves. So what he means is that he argues that for virtuous men, virtue is pleasurable, and other good men are useful to the virtuous man for furthering the good. So in this sense, the perfect friendship combines all 3 of those: usefulness, pleasureness, and the good, but it's all aimed for virtue. So within a friendship of the good and the virtuous, he says, quote, there meet in it all the qualities that friends should have, and thus is a permanent friendship. Aristotle's ideas reveal their most pre-Christian basis in his idea that unequals of class cannot be friends. He, like many, many others, both before Christ and also some Roman philosophers after Christ, they argue that class equality is an absolute prerequisite for shared friendship. And further, it's a presupposition for Aristotle and other Greek philosophers that only aristocrats, only people who are wealthy, who have property, could be men of full and true virtue. it's a little bit detailed. I don't want to get into it. It has to do with only rich people can help others. Only rich people can be magnanimous, give other people stuff. The poor man can't be completely virtuous because he doesn't have the fullness of virtue to give things to other people who don't have things. Just kind of a side note, not totally essential. But the important quotation is one that's, I think, at the end of the handout that I gave you. Either you can listen or you can follow along. But what he says is, he says, in friendship, quantitative equality is primary. So again, the equality you can measure, you can judge. He says quantitative equality is primary and proportion to merit secondary. So again, a person's merit is the secondary element of friendship. It's not the primary element of friendship. He said, and Aristotle continues, this becomes clear if there is a great interval in respect of virtue or vice or wealth. This is most manifest. This is super important. Triple highlight it, put stars next to it. He said, this is most manifest in the case of the gods, for they surpass us most decisively in all good things. Nor do men of no account expect to be friends with the best or wisest men. When one party is removed to a great distance, as God is, the possibility of friendship ceases. This is, in fact, the origin of the question whether friends really wish for their friends the greatest good, that is, of being God's, since in that case, their friends will no longer be friends to them, and therefore will not be good things for them. So let's just pause for a moment and think about what Aristotle is really saying in this, because if we're Christians, this statement should really jar us, because it reveals the limitations of even the best of pagan thinkers. What he's saying is that friendship between the gods and man is impossible, for the same reason that friendship between men of different classes is impossible. The distance is too far removed between the two. Let me pause for a second, both because I'm on the Pacific time and it's getting a little dark in here. I don't know if you can tell, so I'm going to flip on a light. But I'll see if y'all have any questions about what Aristotle has just said. I'm flipping on a light, but I can still hear you.
Could you, I don't know, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, Benjamin. Yeah.
Just what that first one that you read, as far as the quantity versus merit, I was really struck by that. Wondering if you could just revisit that briefly, as far as why, if he ended as with the third being virtue, how that seems like when you look at friendships that you could have, and if the one of virtue, if not the culmination, or including the other ones, I guess, being the highest one, virtue, I would have thought first is merit. And if that's a desirable type of friendship, why he would put quantity first. Sure.
Well, first, remember, the Greeks are not us. The Greeks are not post-Christian thinkers. And for Aristotle's understanding, that necessity of being equal of class is essential, because otherwise you simply could not be friends, for instance, with the servant. Even if you had a noble servant, in Aristotle's understanding, he could never be as noble as a noble nobleman, precisely because he lacks the property or the wealth to be generous to other people. The servant always has to serve another. And so in that sense, there's a type of servile power that's present within that, whereas the aristocrat always can be beneficent to those who are beneath him. But if he's looking for an actual equal friendship, it has to be with another nobleman or aristocrat who is equally as able to be generous to others, specifically with wealth, to achieve that type of equality of persons, or equality of friendship. So that's what he means, that it has to be a type of equality that can be that can be quantitative. You can actually judge it. Oh, these people are equal in the sense that they are both Athenian aristocrats. And so while you also need merit, in some sense, the merit is secondary, because Aristotle acknowledges that there are virtuous non-aristocrats, there are virtuous slaves, but all of them still have the vice, even if it is not of their own choosing, of their social or class position. So Aristotle again sets people in that inescapable class division that you can't even help. I mean, the gods made you an aristocrat, or the gods made you a servant. So you can be the most virtuous servant that there is, but you will never be able to cross over or to move up and to be the most virtuous aristocrat. So if you were to look at the two people, the most virtuous aristocrat will always be here, and the most virtuous slave will always be here, even though they both have achieved as much virtue as they themselves can. It's like an idea of a glass. The aristocrat simply has a larger glass or a goblet, which he can fill, and which the slave or the servant would not be able to fill. Did that answer your question, Benjamin, at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially the last thing you said with relation to the like social position, to think of that notion corresponding to merit versus the way I'm thinking of it is the nobleness of the person, the good that they have as the virtue, rather than thinking of, like in the case of quantity, as you described it, that just looking at the material goods that you'd have, and Aristotle talks about how you need a certain amount just to be happy, that you're not going to be able to exercise certain virtues if you don't have, like you said, the wealth to be magnanimous. And so if you're looking to be friends with someone who has that level of virtue, they would have to correspondingly have that level of goods as well. So
Yeah, and also,
that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, also just keep in mind with wealth, you are freed from the very necessity of serving another. And so through the wealth, or through the position that you are born into, you already have a type of power, political or social power, that the slave could never achieve, could never rise to. This is an area, I think, in understanding of Greek philosophy that we as moderns really do struggle with, because it's so anathema to the way we understand human nature to be. And so you have to really retool your way of thinking or imagining to the way pre-Christians would have seen things, mostly because we don't even realize how radical was the change that Christ introduces into the world through Christianity, which has had reverberations even to our own time, with assuming things as given, which if you were to say the same things to a Greek, they would have said, you're crazy. I mean, the way they even said, as we see in the New Testament, they said of Christ, you're crazy. This is not done. But it's important to understand this pagan view precisely to understand how radical is the Christian one, which I'm about to get into in just a second, unless someone has another question about Aristotle.
I had a question, just sort of the framework that you're using in terms, it's very interesting. Does this play in the way he sort of characterizes at the highest level, sort of the differences between dwarves and elves and even men, but particularly dwarves and elves?
Yeah, no, excellent. I love that you're jumping into how does this relate to Tolkien, because I'd want you to already see how this relates into Tolkien. Let's table your question just for a second, Joseph, because the next section of what I want to give you with this lecture precisely has to do with what Tolkien then is doing in Middle Earth. So we'll table that question for just a second.
Okay.
If I didn't answer it, you can knock on the screen and say, hey, I didn't answer that question.
Well, you did a great job of framing everything up. I'm just, my mind's running wild. It's great.
No, that's great. I mean, it shows me that how I'm trying to direct this is good, because it'd be problematic if someone's saying, I have no idea why she's talking about Aristotle and friendship in this way. This is not making any sense. But it is making sense, which is good. So let's talk about Jesus Christ, because the incarnation challenges this pagan understanding of friendship, precisely in the era that I just said. Highlight that, mark that, because we've got a big problem coming when Christ enters the picture. Because Christ, God himself, he is the one who asks for friendship with his creatures. What does Christ say, and say repeatedly? But he says, I call you friends. If you recall, he says, I call you friends. So Jesus allows us, humans, mortals, created beings, to befriend the gods, because the gods have extended friendship to mortals. Perhaps, as Aristotle would say, a creature would never presume to initiate friendship with his creator. But Aristotle never considers what would friendship look like if the creator initiated friendship with his creatures. St. John tells his readers that, quote, we love because he first loved us. So again, friendship is possible because God first loved us. The teaching of Christ reveals that virtue is possible for all men, regardless of social status, wealth, or class. So suddenly, with the introduction of this idea of supernatural grace, you have the wiping out of the barriers that pagans had previously set. The movement in virtue from the lower to the upper class. Further upsetting this classical model, Christ suggests, in fact, that wealth and material goods may actually be a hindrance to virtue. Christ's economy of salvation is open to all people. And so because of this Christian understanding of friendship is that it is possible between all human beings, men and women of goodwill. So to conclude this section on Christian friendship with a quotation from my patron saint, Saint Teresa of Avila, in which she directly counters this Aristotelian view of God's distance from us. Saint Teresa says about mental prayer, she says, quote, mental prayer, in my opinion, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him who we know loves us. The important thing is not to think much, but to love much, and so do that which best stirs you to love. Love is not great delight, but desire to please God in everything. So we've got this revolutionary introduction of friendship, a turning of the pagan or classical understanding of friendship on its head through the incarnation and teachings of Jesus Christ. And Tolkien, as a Christian, is going to come right along and continue, again, in this derivative way, but that's not a negative, in this derivative understanding of friendship. So let's talk about friendship for Tolkien and its centrality to its work, how he follows in some elements what Aristotle is saying, but how in most others, he's really following that radical revolutionary understanding of friendship that the Christianity demands. So for friendship in Tolkien, one of its striking features is that it is communal. Tolkien, like many other writers, creates one-to-one friendships. And in Tolkien's work, the Frodo-Sam pairing might be the most obvious of that one-to-one friendship. But Tolkien expands this circle of friendship to include many others, both as a testament to Tolkien's skill as a writer and his understanding of this expansive nature of love. Tolkien creates this amazing interactive community of friends. He closely follows that Aristotelian principle that highest form of friendship is between men of virtue who desire the good for the other. Yet he's going to markedly depart from the Aristotelian model by creating friendship not merely between classes, so friendships of hobbits, friendships of men, friendships of elves, but even more so, he departs from that model by creating friendships between gods and mortals. And obviously the one I'm thinking of here is Gandalf. Gandalf represents kind of the immortal or the gods against the mortals. One could also argue the elves as immortals are very similar to gods, but they're not really gods within Middle Earth. But even still, you have friendship between elves, immortals, and mortals. Tolkien breaks from the classical model that Aristotle establishes, and he also breaks from the Enlightenment model of the isolated but very exalted individual to present in this new fashion this old understanding of Christian friendship. Again, it's derivative, it's not new, but it's a new way to present it to us, to a contemporary modern audience. Tolkien's character development is really extensive. Perhaps it might be bold of me to state this, but I'm still going to stick to my guns and say Tolkien has more fully developed characters in the novel of The Lord of the Rings than in any other novel, potentially even any other work of literature except for the Bible. You can argue with me that I'm wrong. John argues with me that I'm wrong. My husband, John, he loves Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is his area. Because Shakespeare and even, for instance, Dante, they may be rivals to Tolkien in regards to character development, but a writer like Shakespeare, he presents these various characters, but across a whole spectrum of different stories or of different plays. Or Dante, while he's presenting hundreds of different characters, they're within different cantos of his poem. So each canto is in some sense separate from the other cantos. And so the characters are not necessarily interrelated. But Tolkien contains his characters in one story thread and within one world. So if literature is a means by which we better understand our own world and our own human relationships, the study of Middle Earth allows us to see human character, because there are so many characters. It allows us to see human character and relationships and friendships in a very complete, in a very diverse, and a very realistic way. So true friendship in Middle Earth, following Aristotle, is absolutely directed towards the good of the other. And it's very important to note that the highest good in The Lord of the Rings is not the destruction of the ring and the defeat of the evil Sauron. And I'll come back to this repeatedly because it's so important in Tolkien's work that the reader not be tricked in some sense into thinking that the end is the ultimate goal, the destruction of the ring. Because if Tolkien emphasized the success of the mission, he would have made the person just into an object, and the friendships of the story only into ones of utility. I hope you see that, using other people's to achieve this end, a good end, and yet you're still using everyone to achieve the end. My father, God rest his soul, he used to talk when I was young about what he called orphans for the cause. And it's always stuck with me. And these were children whose parents neglected or emotionally abandoned them because of the parents' overactive involvement in good and in worthy causes. He was particularly thinking of the pro-life cause, in which he saw a lot of really good families whose children were just wholly neglected because the parents were so consumed in the cause. So again, the causes may be good, they may be worthy, but they're not at the expense of those for whom you have a primary responsibility to love and to nurture. So Tolkien doesn't fall into this temptation to exalt the end over the person, or to use the person to achieve the end. Side note, but parallel to this is why Tolkien hates allegory, because he feels that is the author forcing the reader to a single conclusion that the author has made, and that violates the reader and his or her own freedom. And it also violates, in some sense, the very mode of reading, or the mode of imagination, in which you say this absolutely corresponds to this. in regards symbols. So again, Tolkien will never do that. He'll never say the end is more important than the person, or the person has to be used to achieve the end. Just to jumping ahead and reading, but hopefully from people's knowledge of Tolkien, you'll know the scene that I'm going to reference here. But we see this very clearly in that sinister conversation that Gandalf and Saruman have, when Saruman is trying to persuade his quote unquote old friend to follow his way of thinking. But Saruman, again, this is an Aristotelian friendship. These are equals in race, equals in class, but they are not equals in virtue. They're equal in all things but virtue. But Saruman uses the language of friendship to urge Gandalf to use the ring to destroy Sauron. So one of the things that strikes me with that conversation, we'll delve into it when we actually get to this section. But he says the power is growing, the power of Sauron. He says we may join with that power. As the power grows, its proved friends will also grow, and the wise, such as you and I, may with patience come at last to direct its course, to control it. We can bide our time. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts. And here's the key about using the means to justify the ends. He says, keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose, knowledge, rule, order, all the things that we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak or idle friends. There need not be, there would not be any real change in our designs, only in our means. So again, this understanding of utilitarianism will come up repeatedly in Tolkien, and he will always return to the ultimate truth of friendship. You can never use a friend, even if it's for a good end. Okay, I don't have time to illustrate all the friendships within the work. So as you read, consider this interlacing of people, of characters, of friends that occurs. But let me just focus on this first friendship that we see in the book, which is the friendship between Bilbo and Gandalf, because this is the first very significant challenge to this Aristotelian suggestion that mortals cannot be friends with the gods. Bilbo is a landowner. He's a wealthy hobbit. So in that sense, you could say he's an aristocrat, but he remains part of the peasant race of Middle-earth, which is the hobbits. They're of little account to the powers of the world. Gandalf is what's called a Maya, M-A-I-A, which in the hierarchy of Tolkien's Middle-earth, the Maya are angelic beings immediately below what are called the Valar, who are like the angels. And the Valar are immediately below the one god who is called Iluvatar. So Gandalf essentially is 3 steps down from being the one god. So it's Iluvatar, the Valar, and then it's the Maiar. And Gandalf is a Maiar. And so these are the angelic beings that are assigned to be caretakers of Middle-earth, of the created world. And each Maiar has a specific province. Just like we believe that there are angels that have province over different things, over a city, over a house, over a country. Tolkien is following the same understanding of his Maiar. So Gandalf is an angelic being who has been assigned by someone else. We will see in Tolkien repeatedly this non-specific actor who's present, and of course he's assigned by the one creator who is Iluvatar. But despite these vast differences in class, in status, in power, and even in their very being, Gandalf and Bilbo are friends. They care for the other's good and their well-being, while also enjoying the other person's company, and they work with each other for a common end, for a common good. They have a shared virtuous end that they have. If we look at their initial conversation, you can see that they have this care and trust in one another. I'm using this Houghton Mifflin version, and most people's pagination is the same, but some people don't have the same pagination. But this is over on page 41 when you have this initial conversation. This is towards the end of A Long Expected Party, maybe the middle of that chapter, A Long Expected Party. But this is when Bilbo shares to Gandalf, he says, I am old, Gandalf. I may not look it, but I'm beginning to feel it in my heart of hearts, well preserved indeed. Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like butter that has been scraped over too much bread. That can't be right. I need a change or something. So you see already this type of trust from Bilbo to Gandalf, and Gandalf, of course, urges him to leave the ring to Frodo, and then that's when the friendship begins to have a marring that's to it. If we look a little bit further in this, he says, an angry light was in Bilbo's eyes, and his kindly face grew hard. Well, if you want my ring yourself, say so, cried Bilbo, but you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you. His hand strayed to the hilt of his small sword. So again, Bilbo reacts like this, of course, because of the ring's influence, but also that type of reaction is that sense of violation of friendship that arises when you think, this person wants me for something. He wants to use something that I have. I'm no longer a friend to this person. I'm an object. So again, that's what the ring insinuates into Bilbo's mind, that Gandalf is using Bilbo, violating their friendship. How does Gandalf respond? But he reminds him of their friendship. He says, all your long life, we have been friends. I am not trying to rob you, but to help you. I wish you would trust me as you used. Stop possessing the ring. Bilbo desires virtuously to stop possessing the ring, but this desire, this virtuous desire, is itself strengthened by his friend's desire for Bilbo's own freedom and spiritual well-being, precisely because Gandalf doesn't desire the ring. He desires Bilbo's freedom. That in some sense, the truth and sincerity of that friendship allows for the strengthening of the virtue within Bilbo himself. And Gandalf later tells Frodo that Bilbo is only able to give up the ring because of Gandalf's help. So this is the initial paired friendship that we see, but it quickly expands outward to include many others. Some that follow the Aristotelian model. You can say that's between Bilbo and Frodo, that follows the Aristotelian model of friendship, but much more you have as the community expands, friendships that in no way follow this model. So you have Bilbo and Gandalf, then you have Bilbo, Gandalf, and Frodo. Then you have an addition of Sam that comes into this. So suddenly you have the other hobbits, Merry, Pippin, even little Fatty Bolger, whose name always cracks me up, and Samwise, who's there. So all this friendship suddenly becomes this huge multitude of people, this real expansion of love. There, I think, again, you have that Christian understanding of love as infinite as opposed to love as finite. It's what Dante picks up on at the end of the Paradiso, when you see the joy at another coming to paradise. And I forget what character says it, but I remember the line. He says, lo, here comes another to increase our love. So it's that very understanding that love increases, whereas hate just shrinks in and in on itself. So Tolkien's friendships, his love, just expands exponentially. So this initial fellowship of 4 hobbits, it expands to include a king, which is of course Aragorn. It expands to include Glorfindel, who's an elven lord. It then expands to include Elrond, an elven king. And the circle continues to expand. It adds another elven lord, Legolas. And then to get to, was it Joseph's point? Suddenly you have a dwarf, a natural enemy of the elves, who's part of this community too. So Gimli, who's a dwarf prince. You have a human warrior, Boromir. So the apparent number of the actual fellowship is 9, but in actuality, it includes all these others and includes many more as part of this community. The fellowship may be 9, but again, the quest is only achieved through the interacting work of countless others. So again, while you have friendships between equal aristocrats, much more are there friendships between unequals, except in that very key element of the purpose for the good, the increase of virtue. So Tolkien diverges from the pagan classical view, but he very much follows the new model that Jesus Christ gives to the world. And so in that sense, the eclectic nature of Tolkien's own fellowship very much parallels and reflects that eclectic nature of Christ's own chosen apostles and his own initial disciples, and even the early Christian communities. Okay, so let me stop there, because I've been going on, and I want to also begin to get our own discussion about the initial pages. But let me see what thoughts, questions, responses, objections you all might have to what we've discussed.
I was just curious, and this comes from somewhat personal experience as a Marine. That same Aristotelian friendship that you described, do you think, or how do you think, was it influenced by his experiences in World War I? Because that really describes like small unit infantry, where you take a bunch of knuckleheads from different parts of, different backgrounds, you put them together, throw them through a crucible, and it's something you can't break. I was just curious if that was.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that wonderful question. Yeah, that's something you see in the language of Samwise Gamgee to Master Frodo. Tolkien discusses in his letters how he absolutely modeled Samwise Gamgee on what he called the Batmen of World War I, which were the servants of the lieutenants. England still had a very strong class structure that Americans don't fully comprehend or understand. But every officer was given a type of manservant to tend to his, make his coffee, make sure his boots had the mud off of them, help get the boots off. But more intimately and I think more grievously, those were the men who helped keep many of those lieutenants alive through horrible and disgusting battlefield circumstances. Batmen who risked their own lives to pull their lieutenants, off of the wires, to get them back into the trenches, who themselves would, put their own cloaks over their dying officer. And what Tolkien speaks about is that he saw so much natural virtue in these men who had zero education that he would be forever moved by that type of loyalty, undying, unfailing loyalty that the Batmen showed on the battlefield. So Scott, I think you're absolutely right that his own experience in war helps to affect his understanding. I won't say affect, but to cement the Christian understanding of how human relationships ought to be. Of course, we fail in that idea all the time. But it was that experience on the battlefield that led Tolkien to see how important and essential and even nobler were the Batmen than even the lieutenants and officers that they served.
Oh, great. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, Nicole.
I was just sort of thinking, like, at the when Bilbo first comes in, and there's this talk about how for the hobbits in the Shire, with the exception of Bilbo, I guess, Gandalf is just sort of this sort of Father Christmassy character who shows up with fireworks every once in a while. And I was just thinking how friendship, it doesn't eliminate the differences, even though it's interesting that someone like Bilbo could be friends with Gandalf, but it doesn't make them the same. It's in a sense kind of an equalizer, but it's not. It doesn't make you the same. They keep their distinctiveness. And from the outside, sort of looking in, the hobbits, it's like he is still so other from them. He is they don't even know, they can't even conceive of who he actually is. He's just the bringer of fireworks. And I don't know.
Yeah, well, that I think points to the true beauty of diversity, that one achieves a true diversity through recognizing the unique aspects of people's own personality, and yet you have unity through the things that you love and you share together. And so no, Gandalf is not asking that Bilbo become more like a wizard. He wouldn't want Bilbo to become more like a wizard, because part of his love for Bilbo is the whole hobbitishness of Bilbo. Gandalf loves the hobbits, and not just because they're sort of playthings of his. That's not why he's so enamored of the hobbits, is from this sort of, oh, I'm a god and look at these funny little people that with furry feet that walk around. No, he loves the hobbits because there is a type of innocence that's present within the Shire that others in the book recognize. This is a type of innocence, non-worldliness, that needs to be preserved and protected. That's what Aragorn says, that beautiful line. He says, I forget exactly where he says, I protect these people and get no credit for it, because were I to get credit for it, it would in some sense violate the very thing that I'm protecting. And so he said, I'm happy to do it without any knowledge, and even to take the insults that they give to me, all to preserve this thing that's worth preserving. Yeah, so no, I think that very much, Nicole, part of this understanding of friendship, and again, it's not new. This is part of the Christian view of friendship, is the person is loved for the fullness of their person, of their personality, not for what you could make them into. God loves us for us, and also for the fullness of what he intends for us to be. But again, that's the fullness of, you could say, a hobbit, or the fullness of a wizard, or the fullness of a human, or the fullness of an elf. You fill in the blank. And so there's just a very beautiful element that's there of difference that Tolkien is very much celebrating.
After I read the part on Aristotle for friendship, I kind of guessed where you were going to go with this. And so I read it with a little bit more care than in times past. And in chapter 2, Gandalf makes a case for when Gandalf leaves the mountain in search for revenge for the ring, he says, and there were Gollum's fine new friends who would help him in his revenge, which has always, been an issue in past readings for me, is how, for example, the orcs and other, we might call partners in crime, or some other form of friendship that is not addressed at all, as far as I can tell, within that Aristotelian reading.
Well, part of that, is actually my fault for my selection that I gave you. Aristotle speaks about the friendship that exists between people who, for instance, are thieves. And so he does talk about the friendship that exists with criminals, but he says in that case, it's purely a friendship of use. A thief is a friend of a thief for only as long as the other thief can help him with his thieving. And so if every man wants what is good for himself, obviously the thief wants to get stuff, is to steal things. And so he does form a type of relationship, a cooperation with an other. But if you were to call it friendship, it only is a friendship of use, of utilitarianism. And so that's what you see with the association, maybe that's a better term, association of the orcs or of Gollum. He has what is termed friends, but obviously it's a friendship only amongst thieves, for something for themselves and not for a common good. Or if it's a common good, it would obviously be the common good for the band of thieves, which is exclusively gold or treasure or something like that. But absolutely, they don't love each other for their own sake, except for what that person can do for them. They don't love them because they're a great thief, qua thief. They love them because they're a thief who can get stuff for me as another thief. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, look at the time. We only have 12 minutes. So too much talking. And I can tell you, I won't give you these long lectures for the future classes, but first class is always a little bit different with this. Let's get into our beautiful book, our beautiful work here. You'll notice the very first part of the book is a map. If you flip past the note on the text, the prologue, and all of that. So right before chapter 1, you have this whole map of a part of the Shire. It's not even the whole of the Shire. Tolkien loved to make maps. Cartography, is that the right word? He's a cartographist. He loved map making. Well, what does a map do here? But it continues this simulance of reality. Well, suddenly, gosh, we see the roads of the Shire. We see the parts of the Shire. We see the towns of the Shire, the rivers, the mountains, the woods. All of these things, which in our own imagination can just continue to build up this view of this as a fully consistent secondary world. There's everything in it to make it real. Tolkien spent an immense amount of time on these details. If you look at this, the title of the first chapter, A Long Expected Party, well, immediately just from the very title of the chapter, what are the images that are called forth by the title itself? Well, a party it's fun, it's lighthearted, it's communal. And this is one which is long expected. So the community has been really eager for this party. And so right away, it sets a type of tone for the novel, which is in and of itself a communal one. You could have said a long expected drink, for instance, and that has a totally different connotation than a long expected party. You could have even said a long expected meeting, totally different connotation than the word party. Again, Tolkien, as a linguist, he knows his words and he picks his words very carefully because he sees language as being really the source of human creativity and of human power from God himself. So if it sets the setting of community, well, what's the community of the Shire? What are the positives and what are the negatives? So let's start there just as a conversation. What are positives and what are negatives of this place called the Shire?
It's safe and it's beautiful.
Good. Yeah, very good. Beautiful in a New York City sort of beautiful way?
No, beautiful in the countryside way.
Very good.
Pastoral.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's pastoral, it's rural. You do have this feeling of great safety that's present there. And there's great natural beauty that's a part of it. Wonderful. What are some other positives? People always go for the positives, but we are going to shift to negatives in a minute.
There's a sense of naivete, which can be a positive, but it could also be a negative as well.
Good. Yeah, that naivete could be innocence, and innocence
Right.
most often is good, but sometimes you have to move from innocence to not guilt, but innocence to worldliness, to a type of
Right.
understanding or prudence that's there. Okay, very good. Any other positives that you see? Would you all want to live in the Shire?
They like to have parties, and that's kind of a good thing.
They like to party. What else do they like to do?
Food, lots of meals, like two breakfasts or 6 meals a day.
Yeah.
They love. Is anybody concerned about their waist size? No. Yeah, no one's counting calories in the Shire. They love good beer. Nobody is a celiac. That's quite obvious because they love that bread and they just eat it right up. I don't think they're vegans. They enjoy their meat.
Smoke.
They smoke. That's right. In our age of anti-smoking, they love to smoke.
They have all the virtues.
And what?
They have all the virtues.
They have all the virtues. Which virtue specifically are you thinking of, Brian?
Drinking, smoking, eating well.
Enjoying tradition.
Say again?
Tradition. They love
Mhm.
family traditions and roots and studying their history.
Yes, their genealogies. Yeah, they know who's the son of whom and the cousin of whom, and they know what happened to so and so's grandmother, their cousin way back when, and they like to retell it. Yeah, very good. All these things are positives, elements of the Shire, but there are negatives too. And it's important that we understand what the negatives are, because Tolkien doesn't want to create any ideal utopia within the work. And there are elements in the Shire that are problematic. So what are some of the potential negatives of the Shire? We mentioned naivete as one element. What's another potential negative?
Gossiping,
Gossip.
busybodies,
Spencer, you said gossip?
gossiping and busybodies.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, they gossip and they're busybodies. Who here lives in a small town? I think gossip is much more problematic in a small town than a big town. Who are you in small towns? Have lived in small towns? Okay, big town people or large town might not know the same gossip, mostly because people who are in large towns just don't know each other as well as people who come from small towns. People who come from small towns, they know the history, they know the stories, and they enjoy telling them behind people's backs. Yeah, but gossip is a problem. What other problems do we see arise even in the first couple of pages of our novel?
They lacked a sense of adventure.
Okay.
They're
Yeah,
very insular.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, they're very insular. They lack adventure because they don't really care, is what it comes down to. It's not so much they're scared of the outside, they just don't care about anything except for what goes on within their own world. That can be a problem, and it proves to be a problem in the Shire, this rejection of anything outside of their own particular world, because obviously they think that it will always stay out of the Shire, but it doesn't. The world itself comes into their own world. It's impossible to keep it out. Yeah, well, they not only reject the world, but we see that type of xenophobia, fear of the other, even in regards humorously within the Shire. Why is Frodo kind of like, we don't know about those folks? Where do they come from? What part of the tracks?
The Tooks and the
That's right. Yeah, they come from the other side of the river, Bywater. And so there's, Shire is split. And people on one side of the Bywater, they question those who are the Tooks, because the Tooks are a little bit more adventurous. They sometimes go in the old forest, they tell stories. And that's why Bilbo is looked at so suspiciously, and potentially why he doesn't have any friends. We're told early on in the story, third paragraph, it said he had no close friends until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. We're not told why he doesn't have any friends, but it's striking that he doesn't have any close friends, because Bilbo was I think a pretty fun fellow to be friends with. But he's old. It says at 90, he was much the same as at 50. At 99, they began to call him well-preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. And of course, what do they say? They say it isn't natural and trouble will come of it. Well, they're kind of right that trouble does. Yeah, so they're suspicious even of people outside of their own neighborhood, you could say. That type of judgmental and xenophobia that arises. We're starting to run out of time. Let's talk really quick about what that statement of unchanged is. Unchanged would have been nearer the mark. And this is what Bilbo gets to when he says he feels like he's butter spread over too much bread. What's that problem of being unchanged? My birthday is tomorrow. I'll be 47, and hard for me to believe. Have I changed since I was 7? Yeah, one would hope so. Yeah, one hopes you've changed. Hopefully I've changed since I was 46. Not necessarily essentially, but why is change part of our very beings in this world?
If you don't change, then you never grow in any capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, change implies a type of growth, and if we're talking about within time, and this is what is getting at with the ring and the power of the ring, what's really going on then with the ring and how it is unchanging to Bilbo? Oh.
It's got him stuck in a way where he's unable to progress through the journey of life as he moves towards his ultimate home.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what he means when he says, I feel like butter has been stretched over too much bread. And so what it's suggesting then already about the power of the ring is that it adds a type of quantity without quality. You still have almost sort of the same amount of butter, but now it has to get stretched over everything. It's not like the butter has increased because I don't know, I can't think of the analogy, I keep going, because you're older or have lived more years, you still always had the same amount of butter. And that's what Bilbo is suggesting, is that he feels old. He doesn't look it, but he feels old. So it's a real problem to be unchanged because we are creatures within time. So everything within time must change. The baby must become the toddler, who must become the boy, teenager, man, middle-aged man, old man. It's part of, in some sense, our very nature as beings within a temporal world. And suddenly Bilbo is unchanged. So there's a stasis that's happened, and it's highly problematic. And Bilbo himself is feeling it spiritually. So, okay, let me stop here because our time has come to a close. But I just want to thank you all for a first session. I really look forward to our remaining 7, where we get into this novel closely and talk about the images, the themes, what's going on. So any last questions, Nicole, or I'm going to throw it back to you and Brian.